Hello, everybody. Hi, welcome. Hello, welcome. Glad you're here. As you're all joining, please introduce yourselves in the chat. Say name, title, company, work. Are you an entrepreneur? Do you work in D&I or a related field? And we're also, as we normally do, change our name in Zoom to add our pronouns. So please feel invited to do that as a best practice. Hi, everybody. Good to see so many familiar names. Welcome. I hope your week has been going well. We are at Thursday. Yay. So excited. Hi there. Hello, hello, hello. Hello. Make sure most of you are on mute. You have the ability on this call to unmute yourself when we go into Q&A, but for the purposes of now, let's make sure that you're staying muted so we have a minimum of background noise. And I'm going to add you, Malcolm. Hello, Malcolm. Could I hear you?
Hey, Jennifer. How are you?
Hey, Malcolm. Awesome. Awesome. Very good. So I'm making you a co-host. There we go. Great. Malcolm, tell us where you're calling in from.
I'm calling in from rainy Washington, D.C., which in a normal world, I would say is disappointing, but I actually think there's some value in rain because it keeps people who otherwise would be going out into the world inside. So I'm a little bit appreciative today that it's raining in Washington, D.C.
Very true. And you know, if you're stuck on Zoom all day long, it's not a bad thing to feel like you're not missing out on anything.
That's exactly right. I wouldn't be able to do anything outside anyway, so I might as well stay inside and have conversations like these.
Exactly. This is so great. Well, I can't wait to introduce you to everybody and everyone to you. I've given you a little bit of background. I know you've attended some of these calls, but everybody should know that Malcom Glenn was on my podcast, The Will to Change, I think, gosh, maybe 2 years ago, Malcolm. It was when you were at Uber, right?
Yeah, it was, probably maybe even 2 or 3 years ago, which was a different world, quite frankly.
Different world, yes. Even like 2 months ago.
Yeah,
different world.
Close up.
But it was a great conversation about, I learned so much about the work that you were doing in the Uber context, right? With drivers and accessibility and sort of the economic inclusion agenda you were working on at the time. So it was really cool. And if any of those this is obviously a fine forum for you to bring up anything from those days that applies for sure. So welcome everybody coming on. This is Jennifer Brown. We are adding our pronouns to our names, and I'm seeing our participant number climb. Welcome. Seeing a lot of familiar names on here, the usual suspects I've started to think of you as. We've got Cynthia and Lisa Harris and Chuck Privatera and Joel Peterson, Shayna Walker. We've got Murray Mann. Hello, Murray. Murray's provided some information about the work that he does. So please feel free to use this chat not only to identify yourselves, but provide resources, articles you're reading that you're really loving, anything you really want this community to have access to know about. I find that that's one of the richest takeaways from these calls is what you all are reading and appreciating in terms of helpful content right now and resources and research and statistics as well. Please keep those coming. Okay, so I think I'll jump on in here and get us going, Malcolm. But first, everybody knows these are the questions we are exploring. We talk about, we're actually going to talk, Malcolm and I today, about speed as a potential enabler of bias and how it is a disincentive, I think, to the inclusive lens that a lot of what we are building right now needs. And so I know we're going to cover that today. We're going to cover all sorts of things. I mean, Malcolm has a really eclectic background, and I love kicking around some ideas with Malcolm, particularly around accessibility. So we're going to dive deep into COVID responses and sort of the artifacts of this time and how actually bias has been built into these tools that we're all using and what we need to be mindful of as we use them and at the same time challenge them to be better. So we're gonna talk about some things like face masks. We had a really interesting conversation about that and the impacts of that on certain communities. Certainly mobilizing in solidarity with those who are being affected right now. Malcom has a lot of thoughts on that and a deep specialization in it as well. And I hope everybody on here got to listen in to the Lamika Castillo replay from Tuesday. Tuesday's call they're all great, but please, it was a very rich discussion, lots of ideas, resources, ways that you can support and up your allyship for, in particular, disaffected and, overly affected communities. Lamika had a lot of amazing insights, and I've gotten a lot of notes from all of you about how much you really appreciated having her on the show. So thank you very much for giving me feedback. All righty. So Malcom, let me hand over to you and tell us who you are, what you would like to share about what you're working on right now, which is really interesting. You're about to start actually a new fellowship. So however comfortable you are talking about that work, you can. And just jump into whatever you'd like to share.
Well, that sounds great. And thank you, Jennifer, so much for hosting these calls. Thank you to everyone for joining. I think these conversations are deeply important in a vacuum, in a normal society, in a normal world. And obviously things are very far from normal. And I think as everyone grapples with the challenges of the upheaval in their lives, I think it's really important to have these grounded conversations around something that can really help us through what is an exceptionally challenging time. So my name is Malcom Glenn, and I, as of earlier this month, am a fellow at New America. And New America is a think tank that's particularly thoughtful around issues of technology and sort of forward-thinking public policy. I'm specifically working on a program called The Future of Property Rights, and I'm focused on researching and writing about U.S. housing policy with an emphasis on housing instability and how people experience homelessness. And these are things that I was looking to interrogate well before COVID, and you can imagine the reasons and the ways in which they require especially important emphasis in a mid and a post-COVID world. My background, as Jennifer mentioned, spans a couple of different things. I got my start working on political polling and consulting for issue organizations and advocacy campaigns. From there, I spent some time doing communications for an education reform organization that was specifically emphasizing getting legislation passed to help low-income families. And then from there, I transitioned into tech. And I was at Google for a couple of years leading executive communications for some senior leaders at the company. And then I spent the last 4.5 years at Uber, where I was the head of policy for accessibility in underserved communities. As Jennifer mentioned, really working to try to get the platform to perform better for people from marginalized communities, whether that's people with disabilities, seniors, people from low-income backgrounds. And I think there are so many ways over the course of my career that I've seen how systems don't work for everyone. And I've worked either as a part of institutions or sometimes from an outsider's perspective to try to improve those systems, whether it was from the specific emphasis on what a company can do in its individual pursuits, or writ large, kind of what I've been focused on over the last month, how I can advise institutions from the outside about how they can be more thoughtful about these communities. As Jennifer mentioned, I will be taking on an additional fellowship next month. I'm not quite ready to tell the details of that, but stay tuned. I think it'll be a really interesting opportunity to build on some of the work that I've done in the past and think about how I can apply that to making sure that this crisis is thoughtful around the impact that it has on underserved communities. So Jennifer, I'm excited to talk about whatever you want to talk about. I could continue going on for hours, but I'm happy to take your questions and we can have a bit of a conversation.
Thank you so much, Malcom. I wanted to jump right in on something we were chatting about before the call. You have so many rich examples about, just to pick one artifact of this time is the face mask.
Yeah.
And what implications the sort of our current interpretation of the face mask as it's being worn for certain communities. And I just want you to go into that. Like, any community, you and I talked about it, several different impacts and what we need to really be mindful of in these things that might seem kind of small and unnuanced are actually full of nuance. And this is such a great learning opportunity. Those of us who are on the call, I think, are always looking for educational points of education for our constituents and our stakeholders who are in many ways blind to inequity because it's not something that they experience on a day-to-day basis, right? And this is the way we build allyship, is starting with, hey, did you ever think about it through this lens? And then now that you know that, now that you've been shown, what are you going to do differently to alert others who don't know, right? Which is allyship, right? Is turning around and teaching others. But it's also the question of institutionally, which I know you think about a lot, Malcolm, like as we quote unquote return to work, which I'm not really confident, like who knows what that's going to look like. But like if masks are part of our reality, just to pick one thing, what are all the signals that are actually the meanings of masks and the kinds of masks and to whom? And so I'm just going to put that there and let you run with it.
Yeah, it's a great set of questions. And I think we can look to some other communities that are a little bit more advanced in the recovery from COVID to learn what things are going to look like here in the States. And I have some colleagues that do work with folks in Beijing, and they're starting to, I'm doing air quotes now, return to work, but in a fundamentally different way than they did before. But everyone's using masks, and that is just the way of the world. And it likely will be for the foreseeable future in places in Asia that were hit earlier by the COVID crisis. And I imagine that will be the case now. You're already getting lots of guidance around mask usage. There's some places that make it a requirement for leaving the home or going into businesses. And I think that's going to continue even as the economy starts to open up and people start to get back to some sense of the way they were operating before. But that provides a whole host of challenges for so many communities. And I just think about myself. I was taught at a very early age that I should be really thoughtful around interactions and engagements I have with law enforcement. As a Black man living in America, that's a really interesting challenge for me. And so when I heard people advising me and others like me to go out and wear face masks, that caused a little bit of pause for me. And, particularly when the guidance says, hey, you might not be able to get, a traditional face mask. So just use something that you have lying around the house, like a bandana. And I've seen people on social media posting their red and their blue bandanas as they go to the grocery store. And for many people, that might work well. But the reality is, in some communities, you wearing a red or a blue bandana covering your face out in the world invites violence upon you as a person, both from the perspective of what that's signaling for a gang, from the perspective of what that has historically signaled to law enforcement, a Black person walking into a business, a convenience store, a grocery store, wearing a face covering. And so I've had real pause with this. And I imagine that the people who were implementing this guidance were not thoughtful around what impact this could have on certain people from certain communities. I'll just think about another example. I've talked to people who are deaf or hard of hearing, and they talk about the way in which they rely so heavily on lip reading to fundamentally communicate when they go out into the world, when they're having conversations with people who don't use sign language. Face masks obscure your mouth, and it makes it really, really challenging if you're a deaf or hard of hearing person to communicate in the way that you've communicated your entire life, your entire existence. One last example, it's not even related to face masks, but so many of our cues when we go into businesses now, I went out to get toilet paper at a convenience store yesterday, and there were arrows on the ground that gave us guidance as to where we're supposed to go in order to maintain social distancing. Well, if you're a blind person or a person with low vision, those visual cues don't mean anything to you. And again, we were thinking about these fixes and implementing them as quickly as we possibly can because we're in a crisis situation and speed is really, really important. But I think sometimes that speed and the lack of inclusive thinking in some of those institutional conversations leads us to a point where while we're trying to solve some really, really big problems, we're actually creating additional problems for communities that are oftentimes not a part of the conversation in the first place.
Yeah, Malcolm, you and I also talked about entrances to buildings. Want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, and one of the things that's been really important is the impact on small businesses. And so I try to do my part by going out and supporting small businesses. And one of the things they're trying to do is mitigate the ways in which people can be in a shared space. And so sometimes they're restricting access to go pick up your food to one entrance. And a couple of times as I've walked around my neighborhood, I've seen that the one entrance that they've restricted access to is an inaccessible entrance if you're a person using a wheelchair. And the thought process for them was, of course, you don't want multiple people coming into this space, sharing the same air with each other, which makes perfect sense. But they weren't thoughtful about the fact that if we're going to require only the use of a single entrance, we need to make sure that people who use wheelchairs, walkers, or people who otherwise might not be able to traverse stairs are getting access to our stores. And again, the emphasis on trying to react really quickly is totally understood and appreciated, but we have to be really thoughtful about the disparate impacts that this has on certain communities.
That's right. I mean, what about social distancing for those who are blind?
Right, exactly. We as sighted people have a good sense of where we are relative to the people around us and have a general understanding of what constitutes 6 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet. But if you're a blind person going out into the world, how do you know whether you're encroaching upon another person's space? How do you know whether you are maintaining the required distance between other people? Oftentimes we don't. I think there are ways to get around that, but in an immediate term where we're being asked to take on these new thought processes, a lot of the people who navigate the world don't have the same luxury to be able to just look around and understand where they are relative to other people. And that's going to be a real challenge if you look at other parts of the world where the suspicion is that social distancing is going to be the norm for some foreseeable part of the future.
So Malcolm, I know you have always looked at sort of systemic inequalities, right? So you're at that phase 4 of my inclusive leader continuum, which is an advocate.
Yeah.
So you literally you're the squeaky wheel, you're pointing out, you're telling the truth, you're asking the hard questions. So how might a lot of people on this call have the opportunity, I hope, I pray we have that seat at the table to ask the harder questions right now, to slow the group process down, maybe to counteract the speed and the panic, and to make sure the right voices are around the table so that these things can actually be raised early enough to build more elegant solutions, more inclusive solutions than the solution that's going to be built when you don't have time. You know, it ends up being messy, it ends up being exclusionary, it causes more harm. So, you know, how, I guess as an organizational advocate in these institutions that just don't think this way, what have you learned about getting that and holding that seat at the table, being heard, getting people on board, slowing things down so that we make really good choices and we don't have to like do the workaround on the back end to fix the messiness and the mistakes and the harm?
I think it's a real challenge in the absence of COVID-19 to do these things. But I think this is actually an opportunity because the world has slowed down for most people, and institutions in a lot of ways have slowed down too. And what you were working on before COVID-19 may not be as relevant. And so there's an opportunity now to step back. And I think that's combined with a greater understanding of people's humanity. People often talk about how, and institutions really like to parrot this, how it is important for people to be able to bring their full or their whole selves to work. And I think oftentimes that's rhetoric that's not borne out in practice. But the reality is we can't help but do that now. You can see into my home and I can see into your home. I may have obligations of a personal capacity that make it challenging for me to do my work. I have the utmost respect for every person who's a parent now because they're balancing work and childcare and only a finite number of hours in the day, and oftentimes online distance learning for their kids. And so there's a greater humanity that people, I think, are now bringing to the institutions where they work and where they spend their time. But this is also a very precarious time for the entire economy. And, you know, oftentimes recessions disproportionately hit people who work service jobs, who are more low income from a socioeconomic perspective. This is increasingly going to be hitting everyone. And you're starting to see people doing so-called white collar jobs losing their employment. And this might be a really challenging time for you to, you know, bring up the uncomfortable things for leadership or push your leaders to be more thoughtful around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think there's a real balance that people have to strike between recognizing, hey, listen, this is a time when people are being a little bit more open about the challenges they may have of a personal capacity, but they also don't want to risk their employment in the midst of what is going to be the biggest economic downturn of probably any one of our lives. And so I would say it's really, really hard, but there's also an opportunity, I think, to take advantage of the fact that people are being a little bit more thoughtful around the personal element of people's lives, the human element that people are bringing to their work, and maybe don't push for full bore change immediately, but start to bring up why it might be important to focus on these issues and what you and other people at your institution can do to start to think about the people for whom this crisis may have a disproportionately negative impact.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a way to do it, sort of working with as opposed to against. I mean, last Tuesday, right, we talked a lot about the balance of activism and sort of corporate and advocacy, right? Because we have to translate that activism often into a more palatable version of itself. So a lot of us pull some punches, right? We don't bring the full activist lens, right? Because we just know that, you know, we can't, there's certain things we just can't talk about yet. And yet I think we've been shown things now that we can't unsee. And there is in a way, a openness and an ability and a permission to really tell the truth now, and also to bring in best practices from different domains too. Malcom, you've spent time with public policy and corporate, and you know, I think that maybe this great time to investigate how other domains like the activist world talks about equity and how we might bring that into corporate, and there may be a new receptiveness to it, because like you said, there's no schedule that makes sense anymore. Like everything is kind of up in the air. This may indeed be a time when we could be heard differently for talking about these things. And maybe we do need to have an interdisciplinary approach about how we talk about it. I also think we have to talk about it in terms of business pain points and relate it to people's careabouts too, which we've always known is important. But honestly, the fundamentals of belonging, we always talk on this call that like we on this call and the people that we love and care about in our organizations, you know, we understand belonging on a visceral level. And we particularly understand it when it's not there, right? We've all known, we are either feeling that ourselves, and we're channeling all of those that struggle with bringing their full selves to work. And yes, it is a marketing phrase, right? I know, I love it and I hate it. Bring your whole self to work is so easy for some of us to say, because our whole self and so much of who we are is part of the norm or part of the majority or part of what people are comfortable with. And then we put the rest of it is under that iceberg, that waterline, right? And but we're in this like very transparent moment where, like it or not, we're having to show ourselves. Yes. And so that comes with some really interesting implications. I wonder, Malcom, do you think so? I would imagine, I know you think that the people's stories and truths and authentic sharing is important because that's what moves the needle. I think that's what generates empathy. And then empathy leads to the growth that we need in our colleagues and our, you know, those that would be allies and they're on that journey. You know, people have to see something. They have to know someone. They have to have that moment of sharing that is vulnerable for some of us to share what our lives are really like. So they can say an aha, oh my goodness, I didn't know. I'm so sorry. What can I do differently? But that sharing comes with a lot of risk. So I wonder how you interpret that.
It's exceptionally challenging. And I think it is easier for some people and it's more challenging for some people. And I think you're right. People who perhaps don't think as deeply about those questions of bringing their full selves to work might do it without as much difficulty. But I think folks for whom there are always really barriers to them being their whole self is really, really challenging. And I really like something you said before. You said, we're starting to tell the truth. And that really resonated with me because what it implies, and if I'm being honest, what I have always thought is we have not always told the truth. And we have not told the truth about all of the ways in which institutions are fundamentally broken or inequitable or built in ways that marginalize certain communities. And we are starting to tell the truth about how that has been the case well before this existential crisis that we're facing as a planet. And my question for both myself, for you, for everyone on the call is, what are we going to do after this? Are we going to continue to tell the truth, or are we going to revert back to the ways in which we didn't tell the truth about how, so many people in our society are fundamentally, one life-changing event away from losing their job, losing their home, losing their savings. And we're building all of these institutions, and we're building for a post-COVID world that is going to continue to exacerbate those challenges. Or maybe we're thinking about them in a fundamentally different way, and we're going to be way more equipped to help marginalized communities going forward. I don't really know the answer to that. And I'm a little bit worried about our reliance on reverting back to normal. I know we talked before the call about sort of the mountain of emotions over the course of the day. I go from points of being extremely optimistic about how we can come out of this to being deeply pessimistic, considering the systems that existed before this will to some degree exist after this. So I don't know, but I'm hopeful at this moment, and maybe it's because we're having this conversation, that we'll be able to learn some things from what's gone on, and we'll be able to apply them in a more positive, inclusive, thoughtful way.
Thank you, Malcolm. I love that call to action. I hope you all just heard Malcolm say, will you continue to tell the truth? That's really, you're just throwing down the gauntlet right there. Because, right, and it's hard, and it's risky, and it's something we've all covered, right, as an instinctual response to the risk. I mean, that is what we've gotten really good at doing about a whole host of things that are now on display. They're not hideable. And I'm playing with that too, and thinking net, like, is this, this is a great opportunity, I think, for us to stretch into our authenticity more. For some of us who've, unfortunately or fortunately, for good reason, developed some habits around downplaying, around minimizing, around not really sharing what's really going on. We can challenge ourselves to say, you know what, this matters now more than ever. I have to reflect this, because if I don't reflect this now, we are at greater risk of rebuilding the institutionalized practices we had before this that I couldn't thrive in. The workplace wasn't built by and for so many of us. Like, what if, as Jim Massey said last Thursday, it's the business of us versus business as usual. Business as us, like, we are going to matter. And so how the choices we make right now about how vulnerable we are, how whole we are, and how we present that, it really strikes me that, boy, it really matters now. And I know that saying that might be easy from a place of feeling, if you have certain job security, that you can do something like that, right? And I want to just put that pin in it. But so let me open up. We have tons of really good questions. And Malcolm, I would urge you to maybe go back through the chat and read and maybe see what you want to address. There's a really interesting question here, for example, about bringing our whole selves to work and talking about the truth and triggering some white fragility. So I'm glad that came up. I'm sure everyone on here has read White Fragility. I hope so, I would expect. But Robin DiAngelo is amazing on that. And it is a thing. I mean, as you tell the truth, people are going to be triggered. And the question is, are those people that are going to be triggered people who also can have or not have you in your job? It's a risky thing, right? So there's a little bit of a more than a little bit of a cost potentially for being the squeaky wheel. We all know the statistics about when you are a person of difference from a majority culture, being the squeaky wheel constantly can actually result in penalties for us, right? We become sort of known as our identity. And we are, with a little nice adjective ahead of that, like the angry, the strident, the whatever. So that's another reason why I think how we communicate at this time really matters, that the words we use, the language we choose, how we present this as something that is a potential derailer for not just business, but like people and engagement going forward. This is an imperative topic. D&I is so not beside the point right now. It is actually core, critical to how companies are going to flourish in the future. And so we have to combat some of the negative stereotypes about our work, sadly, that still persist, But I do think I'm always encouraging D&I professionals to speak about things in language that others can understand. You know, we meet that client where they're at. We don't run far ahead and say, why aren't you catching up with me? We don't inundate people with too much information where they're so uncomfortable that they just shut down. You know, we have to keep people with us right now. And we've got to go together through this. And that can be really hard, I think, when some of us feel, you know, reasonable anger and frustration about why did it take a pandemic? Why did it take a pandemic to talk about the things that we've all known have been going on for so long? But it may have taken the pandemic to tell the truth. I don't know. I mean, I think honestly it did. So, all right, I will, let me unmute you all if you'd like to make any comments, and Malcolm, you can read some of the chat while we're doing that.
Sure, I'll start with one, and I apologize if this is out of order. There are so many fantastic comments and questions that I'm just trying to find one that is clearly a question that I can respond to. So it looks like Alex Krantzler asked, how can folks at the bottom, the ones who quite frequently are the most marginalized, people of color, trans and non-binary folks, people with disabilities, lower set, et cetera, how can they be empowered to spark these conversations within larger organizations? And I think that gets at many of the sort of foundational challenges that people and institutions have. You know, I feel like I am marginalized in some way, but I'm looking to make change within this institution. I think it really is important to kind of utilize, and I see that my friend Sean Connor made a comment about this, utilize some of the external folks who may be able to push forward on some of these changes. And so when I worked at Uber, I did this a lot. I would actually work to build allies outside of the organization with folks who represented issue groups and advocacy organizations and nonprofits. And oftentimes when I said something at an organization, people didn't listen. The leadership didn't really listen to what I said. But I would oftentimes say, hey, listen, this person from outside the organization is also saying this thing. And this person outside the organization has a lot of influence with someone we care a lot about. So maybe it's prudent to listen to this person inside the organization. And we would actually work together, myself and these external partners, to then figure out the best way to message those arguments internally. And so I was a bit of an external advocate working with folks in communities outside of the institution where I was, but also a bit of an internal advocate, really learning from those external folks and understanding the ways to push that cause forward in a way that, and I think Jennifer alluded to this earlier, is aligned with the business. And so maybe I want to do this work because it's the right thing to do. And it's obvious that we should be doing this work as an institution with lots of resources and opportunity. But maybe the argument I make internally is not, this is the right thing to do, but maybe it's, hey, this is going to be good for the business and here's why. And coming up with those metrics and understanding what moves the levers in your institution is a really, really important way to go about making that change. And if you're coming forth with a good argument, even if you're at the so-called bottom of that totem pole, if your argument's good and it's good for the business, people are going to listen to you. So finding ways to focus it around some of those things that you know people care about can be really, really valuable.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, and like activating your champions. I know Ryan's on the call. Hey, Ryan Wunderkind, talking about the ERG leaders. Like they literally went through some restructurings, and some ERG leaders ended up sadly leaving the company. And some of the ERG leaders that stayed, it turns out the executive sponsorship of the work that those networks are doing really was instrumental in, you know, ensuring that those people stayed in those roles. And, you know, it's an interesting thing about work. I always say we need to work smarter, not harder. And to me, that means working through others. You know, we cannot, I just put in the chat, you can't be a prophet in your own land. And it's difficult when you're always the one. So working through others and enabling those champions to teach or share or witness or support or champion so that you have lighter work for you, by the way, because this helps us not be so burned out, always being the one that brings everything up and doing all the emotional labor. But working through others means that you have, you know, a network of champions that you can work through. Right? Because the messenger matters as much as the message in this work. And I might even argue perhaps more sometimes. Who you're hearing something from has everything to do with whether you're going to believe it and whether you're going to see yourself as being able to emulate that person. And so, you know, I always find it really fascinating to notice the power of the messenger, the identity of the messenger, the visible and invisible identities of the messenger also, and who can see themselves in that messenger so that they may also change and become a messenger. And so, you know, I just give you some of those tips that I've noticed. I think that are good, and it's self-care, honestly, to realize that you're not alone and not everything is on your plate, but that leveraging others is the critical skill right now, and strategically doing that so that this information we want so desperately to get out into our organizations is being said and heard by surprising places, by surprising people, right? It can't just all roads can't lead back to us. You know, we've got to enlist people with power to say the same things that we've always been saying, because they will be heard in a different way.
Jennifer, I just will call out two things that you just said that I think are fantastic and spot on. One is the power and importance of the messenger. I'm a bit biased as my background is largely in communications, but that couldn't be more important in the context of any decision making. You know, oftentimes people think of communications as this sort of secondary or ancillary part of work. It is core to everything that we do, and the most effective folks in any work context, no matter what they're working on, are also really effective communicators. And to your point around working through others, that often doesn't mean that they're the ones doing communicating, but they recognize that there are different messengers who are more valuable in different situations. And I just think that is oftentimes an overlooked component of getting really thoughtful work done in a way that's not, as you said, necessarily harder, but smarter. And integrating those thoughts around what is effective communications can go a long way in making the work better for everyone in all respects.
So true. And remember that, you know, would-be allies are looking for ways to help, right? We can't forget that. People that I focus on, the question that comes to me always is, I just don't know what to do. And right now people are overwhelmed, right? With sort of all the problems, right? And so I think even more so now, to direct people, to give them something concrete to do, to say, to communicate about, to support, to throw their weight behind, is actually built. There's gratitude in that. Because it points our energy, and it's clarity in the midst of ambiguity, which is what we're all kind of living in. And even pre-crisis, there was a ton of ambiguity about, like, where do I start and how do I use my voice, especially if I'm somebody of power or influence and people listen to me. And this crisis has exacerbated it. But I also think really great leaders are coming to the fore right now too. I mean, I think we're seeing who is comfortable leading with empathy, who's comfortable being vulnerable and saying, I don't have the answers and I'm learning so much from you, who's coming to our table and seeking us out and seeking our insights, and is reaching into the organization and listening. I think that we're seeing a sort of revision of what we think leadership really is, good leadership. And that's something we've got to hold on to for dear life, because we can't go back to the command and control of the old days. We've got to help our leaders show up differently, support them when they do, and then institutionalize that different way of showing up differently so that we don't go back to what was before. So would anybody like to share or ask me or Malcom a question?
Yeah, I know it's hard to unmute and jump in on the Zoom, but I always love
Please do.
the live questions, so feel free.
I'm going to jump in since Malcom already said my name. Hey, Sean Carney, and Malcom is my friend and former colleague. Malcom, I'd love for you to talk about, because I know you've done this work, being able to have empathy across issue, right? We work together on accessibility issues, and we are blessed to be able-bodied people. But talk about those lessons that you learned working with communities that you might not have been a part of, to advocate on their behalf internally.
Thanks, Sean. It's such an important question. And I'll actually start slightly before getting to your answer, which is it's really challenging sometimes to avoid being pigeonholed, because sometimes you will walk into a space and people will identify you in a certain way and expect that you are the voice or the messenger exclusively for those type of people. And you also might be more than one type of person, and they might be dismissing a different part of you that might not be as visible or they don't think is as prominent. And so I've worked over the course of my career to really get outside of being pigeonholed. I walk into a room and oftentimes people see me as the Black man, and they expect that I will be the expert or the messenger on behalf of the so-called, now I'm doing air quotes again, Black community, or the Black perspective. And I have good insight into context around many communities that may fall under that category. But I also have tons of insight, as we've talked about today, around the community of people with disabilities. And I think it really requires you to step outside yourself in order to be thoughtful around how to understand the needs of people who are not like you. And a lot of that, just at a very basic level, it's going to sound so trite, is just listening. I didn't know what I didn't know before I started working with the disability community. And I was honest and okay and comfortable in some ways with my ignorance, but I listened, and tons of people who are experts in this space, who have lived experience, who can help me understand the context that I'm missing, they talked to me and they continued to educate me. And I learned and I continued to listen. And over time, I built up the ability to then go back to our institution, in the case of me and Sean, and help advocate on behalf of those communities, many of whom were quite significantly underrepresented within those institutions. And so I think it starts by making sure that you're not pigeonholed, then understanding what you don't know, learning what you don't know, and then really working hard to advocate on behalf of those people, not as a representative or a member, but recognizing that you are an ally. And sometimes in the context of being an ally, you may have a perch that other people don't have, and you always need to keep their interest in mind as you're thinking about it. And then have them check you, say, hey, this is what I said. Was this the right thing? You're going to get it wrong sometimes. You might not always know the right thing to say or do, but being really transparent with the folks who represent these communities and have this lived experience is the only way that you're going to get better, particularly when you're not a part of that group yourself.
I've been calling it, each one of us has the ability and unused capacity, I think, to be allies to a host of other dimensions that we don't share. So Malcolm, to me, I almost feel like when we think about the iceberg and what's under the waterline, you just talked about your allyship for a certain community that you may or may not like walk in the room and say. And I love that you just disclosed that, but it's not visible about you. So unless I know your job, like unless I know you. So I do think that allyship needs to move from the private to the public to the visible, because that's where we can see what it looks like. That's where we can emulate how somebody does that. And meeting Malcolm, it may sort of, how do you get your head around like all his identities, right? And yes, all of those things can exist in one person, and all those things exist in all of us. But we need to speak about allyship as really 360 degrees. You know, it's not, that's the way my thinking has really changed to say, well, I'm not just an ally for certain communities, and I don't just need allies as an LGBTQ woman, but I can be both, and I need to be both. And that needs to be this, like, there's a fluidity to it. It's not a binary at all. It's more of a mosaic where I zoom in or I zoom out on the different colored tiles all the time. And I'm thinking, well, I know this color well, but I don't know this at all. And I need to pay more attention to this. And, you know, to me, or I need to use my voice here because there's nobody speaking from an ally perspective for this issue, this community, this experience. And it's tricky, I know, but sometimes you're the only one in the room and you have some choices to make about what you really raise and what you're bringing into that room, how you're spending your time, because time is valuable. Where are you pointing people's attention right now? And it's hard when there's so many communities that are being disparately impacted right now. How do I even choose? Like, it just feels like there's so much right now. How do I prioritize what's most important for learners who are listening to us? Because we're the ones that are on the, you know, many of us have our finger on the pulse in our organizations. You know, there's so much to share right now about belonging and about impact. It's hard to know where to start.
I think that point about prioritization is so key, Jennifer, because I know myself personally am oftentimes sort of paralyzed by all of the choices that there are, and that can be really, really challenging. And so what I always say is just do one thing. And when you do one thing, then do another thing, and then do another thing. And it might not be perfect. It might not be the right prioritization, but it's better to do one thing and it not be the best thing versus not doing anything because you're so focused on which are the things you need to do first.
I love that advice. Thank you. Thanks,
Hey,
Malcolm.
Jennifer, it's Michelle Birnbaum. How are
Hey,
you?
Michelle. Hi.
I'm not sharing my video today because I'm having a doozy of a time with allergies and no one needs to see it. But what I'm also thinking is when we're giving a lot of people the opportunity to be at new tables now with, you know, the remote working, those fortunate enough to have jobs. And when I'm thinking about the ones who are in corporate in some ways, you know, the people who may have formerly not been able to commute into work or to certain meetings because perhaps transportation was difficult and accessibility was hard. But like from the waist up, for example, like you could be in a wheelchair or you could be fully abled, you know, so there's a lot of ways to think about it. I'm thinking that from an ERG perspective, which I know you know a lot about, you know, some folks still need to be reminded on how they can help from a grassroots perspective, and storytelling is a big part of that. And I'm wondering, you know, has any thought been given to, you know, getting a platform for those folks to have their voices, whether it's through videos or day-to-day stories of how, you know, people are kind of coping and getting through from work to even going to CVS if they needed to and couldn't get a delivery slot. You know, how can folks in our world better empower those in the ERGs from a distance to be able to share and advocate?
Good point.
And even beyond their workplaces, you know, if they go into town and they need to get something and sort of being a voice for a bigger community.
And we have maybe less, I think what you're getting at is there's maybe less data because when we're physically co-located, these stories sort of come up organically, or perhaps we witness something that happens, or perhaps we run into a colleague that shares a story with us about what just happened, right? And that's our learning. And now we have to be much more intentional in seeking those stories and then documenting them, right? And
yeah, or even broadcasting platforms like internal blogs or whatnot. You know, there's different ways, but I'm thinking also, you know, thinking about all the folks in an organization, it's another way in organizations, not ours, because we're all in different places and have been in different places, but how to tie them in.
Yeah.
And leverage their point of view and experiences.
Yeah. Any
That's
comments
all,
from the group on that? Is there anything you all are doing in your organizations that is soliciting like true life stories that are educational, that are like elevating new voices in a virtual world?
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? This is Evan.
Hi, Evan.
Hi. I was wondering if you were thinking of this. I just sent it to the group chat, but it's very fitting. I'm a content producer and I work a lot with BNP Paribas Bank. And we came up with this concept of remotely interviewing ERG employees about what their experience has been like thus far in the pandemic. And as a documentary producer as well, sometimes, aspiring documentary producer. I'm sticking with the corporate side for now, but we went down a path with certain questions, and the stories we ended up getting from these ERG leaders went down different roads as well. It was really an amazing experience for me as a white man with privilege to hear some of the stories about minority communities, in particular the Black and Hispanic community here. I spoke to family members of some of the ERG leaders, and in general, it was amazing to get to put this together. We also did an internal version. So we rolled out one on social, one longer one internally across globally the bank. And that one was about 3 minutes, and we got enormous response from it, from employees especially. This is the kind of content we need to see right now. I didn't know that, things like that. So now we're working on other ERG videos as a result. So it's definitely a good idea, Michelle, that you were talking about there, and it works.
Thank you, Evan. I was totally thinking about you, and then you appeared. Please watch the video. It's great. It's
Thanks.
Really, I think it's a sort of leap, another quantum leap we're experiencing to make things like this and have them be so powerful and have them be so grassroots, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I think gone are the days of those slick video. I mean, your video is slick, Evan. It's beautifully done, but it's an example of the democratization of communications and how we tell our stories and how our stories are shaping our institutions. And maybe this is a time when ERGs are going to just explode in terms of our global memberships, right? We talked on one of these calls, I think, about the fact that we are now reaching out more globally. Like maybe before we were biased towards our headquarters locations or corporate locations, but we have an opportunity now to truly wrap our arms around the global ERG communities that we encourage, to say that one voice in Serbia matters. And that person has just as much of a spot in a Zoom call or video as anybody else. And so I'm really actually also looking forward to that whole thing unfolding, the inclusion that we need to practice within our communities. And also, by the way, we always talk about on this call, the intersection within our communities, right? So those threads that roll horizontally through all of our identities that a lot of us share: mental health, parenting and caregiving challenges, spirituality, religion. There's lots of things we haven't really talked about that actually unify us. And so we have this kind of vertical and horizontal strategy going on at the same time, which I think is going to also revolutionize the way that we do our programming. And when we think of our communities of identity, we are getting like layers added to that right now, which is so cool. And I don't think we'll ever be able to go back and look at things in purely like one single identity silo, which was never accurate to begin with, but it was sort of shorthand to find each other and to do things and to make sure the organization, wasn't being overwhelmed with the complexity of all of who we are. But honestly, look at the LGBTQ plus community, like talk about complexity, talk about diversity issues too, right? That we haven't always been the most inclusive group of people, even though we like to think that we are. All right, thank you for all the good stuff in chat. Who else would like to weigh in?
Hi, everyone. This is Brian. I'm sure we're all surprised that I have a question. I'm always thinking. One thing that strikes me is, Malcom, your experience, both what I'll use as an external activist and someone who's really pushing for organizations to make change, but you've also been inside the organizations as an influencer. And Jennifer and I were having a conversation the other day about how that healthy tension is really important. But when I think about it from the lens as a DEI practitioner internally, and you've had these two experiences, did it change how or did you make conscious decisions to say, here's how I'm going to show up inside versus how I would be an activist internally? And what would you suggest to us from your learnings?
It's such a great question. And the short answer is yes. I definitely was very thoughtful about how I presented myself in a whole host of ways to external audiences. And then depending on what that external audience is, who those people were, and then certainly to internal audiences. And I remember having a conversation with a former colleague and saying, I think in order to do this work right, you have to be comfortable with everyone being upset at you. And externally, you always get the perception from folks that you are not pushing this institution far enough. Maybe we like you, but we still want them to be going further, and we still want greater accessibility, or we still want greater inclusion of people from certain communities. And that's totally fair. And there's always an expectation, and there should be an expectation that I go further. And then internally, there's this frustration sometimes that you're the person who's always sounding the alarm. You're always the person saying, hey, we need to be more thoughtful about these communities. Why can't you just sort of let us go and move and make things happen within the business? And so I think that's almost kind of how those roles work in an optimal way is, there's always an expectation that you go a little bit further from one side or the other side, but because both sides kind of feel like you're doing something, then that probably means there's some progress there. I think the question more generally of, how you present yourself in different circumstances and in situations is one that people who feel like they are other in the context of the majority are always dealing with. In an optimal world, that perhaps wouldn't be the case. We would be able to bring our full selves to every situation. But I think about something that is very culturally resonant for me, which is called code switching. And it's just this notion of how you speak differently to ingratiate yourself with different groups. And it's something I absolutely have practiced my entire life, continue to practice. And I practice it not just in the way I talk, but how I frame things, the way I go about explaining things and providing context. And it is always something that I'm thoughtful about, particularly when I'm navigating between two institutions. But I think there's something a little bit healthy about both of those institutions sort of nudging you to be a little bit more thoughtful around their concerns. I probably wasn't always going too far enough with the external audiences. And perhaps sometimes I wasn't thoughtful enough about the long-term business implications of doing something internally. But continuing to push and feeling a little bit of healthy tension being pushed back against you as you're presenting the different contexts and ways you go about things in those different environments, I think is really, really important. And, you know, for better or for worse, something I'm very familiar with just in the context of going about my life and thinking about how I'm presenting myself depending on who the audience is.
Healthy tension. Yes. I think having to shapeshift around people who may not be where we are is an incredible learning exercise. To me, it feels like it's uncomfortable, and I wish it weren't so, but like, what would the challenge be as an educator if everybody always understood everything you said and it was just great? You know, that would be what a world. But it forces you to crystallize and I think maintain an awareness of where the other is as you introduce concepts in teaching, and there's something in that makes us smarter, that makes us better. And by the way, it's inclusive, right? It's a challenge we all have to be up for. We wouldn't do this work otherwise. I think if we were really told the truth, I think many of us probably love that challenge. You know, we love creating an aha moment in someone that didn't understand something before. I mean, we live for those moments. That's why we do this work, I think. You know, we live for that, like, oh my gosh, I turned the light bulb on for someone. In the way I presented that, I was able to move somebody from A to B, and not just through force, but through the fact that they actually went on a journey and ended up somewhere different, and, you know, feel good about how they got there too, that it wasn't a forced march, but it was actually an invitation. And also it was a joining of hands and hearts between me and another human to go on a walk together and end up somewhere. So that is those, I don't know about all of you, but those are the moments that I really am, I think, proudest of. So I think what you're talking about, we can say code switching is harmful, having to do it. But I also know that to be inclusive, you know, we have our own work to do in terms of being inclusive of so many other people, and how do we make a connection with them and help move them along is the challenge of a lifetime. So yeah, living corporate, we're getting some good podcast ideas. Code Switch is a great podcast on NPR. So please listen to it. I love Still Processing as well. It's another New York Times podcast by two queer culture writers of color. And they literally talk about media and all this really, really good stuff. I can't even describe it. It's very eclectic. So there's a lot of really good places to get information. Thank you. Thanks for this. It's great. Oh my gosh, we're running out of time. Oh, I hate this. Any last thoughts? Malcom, anything we haven't talked about today that you really want this community to be thinking about, feeling, any comforting words, any challenges that you want to give us before we lose you?
Yeah, and thank you again, Jennifer, so much for the opportunity. It is just so rewarding to be in a space with so many people who are thoughtful around these issues, because as we know, everyone isn't, and it couldn't be a more important time. One thing I will just say, and we touched on it a little bit before, is I think we should always be really intent on questioning the systems, both the systems in which we are a part and the systems we perceive from the outside. Because I think the lack of questioning of so many of these systems is part of the reason we find ourselves in such a challenging situation today. And I think if we continue to question these systems, both through the context of this crisis and as we start to emerge from this crisis, that's the only way in which we are going to return to a normal, steady state that is improved, better, and more inclusive than the one that preceded this crisis. And so let's continue to question systems, figure out how we can make them better, and find the allies who can help us improve those systems, whether it's from the inside or from the outside.
Malcom, you've been wonderful today. I think we're all so grateful to you. Thank you for being a voice for so many. Thank you for your allyship. Thank you for bravely showing up with all of who you are to all of the environments that you're in. And like, we want to hear about your new fellowship and what the focus is going to be. So I think I want, you and I probably have a podcast episode in our future together, because I know what community you're going to be focusing on next. And it was a bit of a surprise, and needed something that we haven't talked about today. So,
well, that sounds good. I can't wait to chat again with you, Jennifer. Thanks so much. And thanks to everyone else as well.
Welcome. Would you be willing to be reached by folks if you want to share your info? I know you're on LinkedIn. I talk to you there all the time.
Yeah, I would love to connect with folks on LinkedIn. You could just type in my name and find me there. I actually have a website, so you can find me online at malcomglenn.com. And there's a contact opportunity if you just click the link, and you can send me a message, and would love to stay in touch and find ways that we can work together and collaborate.
Love it. Remember, Malcolm's name is spelled with only one L, not two.
That's right. Malcomglenn. Thanks for that, Jim.
Pro tip. Yes. All
Yeah,
right,
I got it
everybody.
wrong several times in the chat. I'm so sorry, Malcolm.
No worries.
I saw you correct yourself, Brian. So for next call, next Tuesday, John Basil is going to join me. So I don't know if any of you know John, but he was at Fidelity for 30 years and worked his way up and ended up in the diversity role, and ultimately the chief diversity officer there in the last, 5 to 10 years of his tenure. And he's one of our consultants at JBC. And he wanted to be retired, but we wouldn't let him. And so he's going to be joining me on Tuesday. And I'm really excited. Having chief diversity officers on here is always a treat. I know that some of you might have missed Sophia Bonnett's episode from IBM. Sophia, Sofia. Please go back into your emails if you can't find the replay, please get in touch with me, info@jenniferbrownconsulting.com. But it was an incredible conversation too about what's happening at IBM. And so I'm sure John will illuminate us and be a great sounding board for us to think about our strategy at this time. And is also a member of the LGBTQ+ community as well. So, well, I appreciate all of you. I know you're all dropping off now, but huge hugs. Keep it up. You are a voice for many who need you more than ever. Take care of yourselves. Put your oxygen masks on. And bless you all for the work you're doing, and enjoy the weekend. Get some time for yourself. This is a marathon, not a sprint. And as always, reach out to me at info@jenniferbrownconsulting.com. Much, much love to everybody. See you later.